If Baldur's Gate 3 left you with that existential void of, okay, now what? Today I'm handing you a treasure map. 10 new RPGs that deliver heavy choices, a satisfying party to build, and that tabletop campaign vibe only almost no one is talking about them yet. And let me warn you, this isn't a more of the same list or the usual recycled titles, so stick with me until the end, because right in the middle of this list is at least one game that looks like it was made for people who loved the insane freedom of BG3 and want to feel that same energy of discovery before it becomes mainstream. I'm Matthew, and the video starts right now. If you enjoyed Baldur's Gate 3 because of that taste of a tabletop campaign, decisions, broken builds, and tactical combat that makes you want to pause and think, then Pathfinder: The Dragon's Demand is a game you need to put on your radar right now. It is a single-player, turn-based CRPG focused on deep customization and a faithful adaptation of the Pathfinder 2nd Edition Remaster rules, made in partnership with Paizo and with a very clear proposal. Recreate the magic of tabletop in a digital format, but without the limitations of a physical board. The game looks like a tabletop RPG diorama, but turbocharged with adaptive poses, effects, and a truly 3D grid system. It's not just squares on the floor, it becomes a space with height and depth. This changes the way I imagine fights happening, because the studio itself talks about real vertical movement, climbing, flying, levitating, swimming deep underwater, and dynamic weather with effects that can impact visibility and interaction with the scenery, cover, stealth, squeezing through cracks, using rope, forcing doors with a crowbar. On the BG3 vibes side, I feel the similarity comes from the freedom of character and party. You create builds with 7 ancestries, 16 classes, and over 30 backgrounds. Play up to level 8, and still assemble a group of 4 plus up to 3 companions, choosing from various characters that appear in the adventure. And yes, there are companions with their own motivations, and even the possibility of romance, plus professional voice acting and a promise of over 30 hours of gameplay, meaning there's plenty of meat for those who like getting involved with the group and the consequences of their actions. And the setting is exactly that type of fantasy I like when I want a roots campaign. The story revolves around the return of a legendary dragon and the threatened town of Belhaim, with a large and reactive world, lots of NPCs and quests that respond to your choices. The foundation comes from a classic Pathfinder adventure, The Dragon's Demand, from 2013, but the game version promises to expand with new areas, side quests, and a personal story for your character linked to the Dark Tapestry. New Arcline is a CRPG that deserves your attention. It is a single-player, story-rich, and party-based game that drops you into a very juicy conflict between arcane magic and a steampunk revolution, with zeppelins, gadgets, and sorcery fighting for space in the same world. The plot is this. You arrive as an immigrant in the city of Newark looking for a cure for your family's fatal disease, and the promise of progress soon shows its rotten side factory smoke, segregation, inequality, and corruption. I like this kind of setting because it gives a human weight to the roleplay. It's not just about saving the world. It's about surviving in a system that chews people up, and then every decision becomes easier to justify, even when you choose the dirtier path. On the RPG side itself, the game lets you play with identity and consequences, creating a character, human, elf, dwarf, or giant, choosing a background, and dealing with prejudices and different reactions depending on what you are and what you do. And it has that party glue that reminds me of what many people went crazy for in BG3. Recruiting companions, learning personal stories, making allies and enemies, and yes, even romance, which gives that good soap opera spice in the middle of the strategy. And what holds all this together in the gameplay is the mix of progression and tactical turn-based combat. You can specialize in magic, like Hellfire Occultist, Voodoo, Celestial Sage, or go for the technological side, Steampunk Mechanic, Dieselpunk Engineer, Tesla Punk Scientist, with 6 classes and 12 subclasses promising plenty of builds to test. I dig it, because from what the official material describes, you can face fights with brute force or with cleverer strategies using skills, spells, crafting, and consumables, that type of combat that makes you stop, look at the field, and think, okay, how do I break this my way? GreedFall. The Dying World is one of those narrative RPGs that deserve to enter your radar now because it lives on choices, alliances, and consequences in a political and sick world. It takes place 3 years before the first GreedFall, at the beginning of the Malachor Plague, and puts you as a native of Tir Fredae, who is captured and taken by force to the old continent of Gakane, and from there is born this survival plus conspiracy vibe that I think is very easy to get hooked on. You don't start as the all-powerful chosen one. You start as someone trying to regain their own freedom while stepping into intrigues between factions and trying to understand who is pulling the strings. The premise makes it clear that your journey turns into a game of influence, reputation, and decisions that mess with alliances and the direction of the adventure. And this is exactly the kind of fuel that makes a BG3 fan feel at home, even with a very different style. And here comes the part that I personally love when a game delivers good company. Here you can recruit up to 8 companions, each with beliefs, secrets, and goals. And the game already hints that they aren't just there to hit enemies, they can help you get information, diffuse tense situations, or make everything worse, depending on your relationship and your choices. Just the way I like it. A party that feels like real people, with friction, loyalty, and that potential for, okay, I didn't want to hurt anyone, but I had to choose. In gameplay, it goes for real-time combat with tactical pause, which lets you coordinate actions and exploit weaknesses. And, if you want, focus on one character while the rest act on their own. Between one scrap and another, you explore Gakane aboard the ship Constanzia, passing through different cities and regions, with the world reacting to your decisions and shaping your reputation and your bonds.
Stars seem far away. I can't be blinded by the dark. Yes, I won't be blinded by the dark.
If you enjoyed Baldur's Gate 3 for the weight of choices and the feeling of, I am living a campaign, then put Norse Oath of Blood on your radar. It is a turn-based, tactical Viking saga that swaps high fantasy for a more grounded, brutal atmosphere. Much more mud and blood than magic and dragons. It arrives on PC on February 17, 2026. And the proposal is to make you feel that every decision is a brick in the reconstruction of your life and your vengeance. You play as Gunnar, a young warrior who enters a journey of revenge after Steinar Farspear kills his father, Jarl Grip, and takes his place. And what catches my attention here isn't just the I will get revenge, but the idea of having to rebuild yourself in the process. Rebuild, gather people, stitch alliances together, and transform indignation into long-term strategy. If BG3 is about building a group that becomes family or becomes chaos, here it seems to be about building a brotherhood of war and seeing who really stays when things get tight. In gameplay, the backbone is tactical turn-based combat with a lot of emphasis on positioning, terrain, and unit synergy, the kind that punishes you when you try to go on autopilot and rewards you when you read the battlefield like a living board. From what the materials describe, you can use things like flanking, elevation, and even environmental hazards to turn difficult fights in your favor, and every warrior has their own kit that changes your range of options, which is great for those who like building comps and testing combinations. I'm already imagining that classic moment, you win by a detail, not by stats. And here comes the part that sells the package for me. Besides battles, you build and manage a settlement that directly feeds your power in combat. It grows from a camp to a fortress, assigning roles to residents, managing resources, and upgrading buildings to unlock equipment, units, and real advantages. This gives that delicious sensation of a layered campaign. What you decide outside the fight changes what you can do inside it, and vice versa. Very much in the spirit of RPGs, where preparation is half the victory. Oh, and there is a cool touch of expanded universe. There is a prelude short story, Sword Brothers, written by author Giles Christian, tying the narrative atmosphere of the game together even more. Call of Saregnar is that type of niche RPG that grabs those who loved Baldur's Gate 3 for the immersion, but delivers it in a much more grounded and investigative way, with a medieval fantasy atmosphere that is less flashy and more mysterious. The premise won me over easily. In a village called Avonmore, people start disappearing and the local lord is murdered inside his own room, and your search for the culprit escalates into a conflict much bigger between gods than it seemed at the start. What catches my attention here is the focus. It is described as a game of exploration and investigation, with an emphasis on story and characters, and that abandons RPG cliches and expects you to think meaning, less quest checklist, and more of you actually reading the world and making decisions with care. For those who left BG3, missing that feeling of I need to talk, observe, and connect the dots, this direction is exactly the kind of promise I want to see an indie fulfill, and it has a very specific retro spice. The game positions itself as a nod to the era of party RPGs from the 90 seconds, those more contained yet dense ones, which already puts me in a different mindset than BG3. I expect something slower, tenser, more walk, discover, suspect, and less spectacle. And honestly, when the writing is good, this type of rhythm becomes an addiction because you start treating every new piece of information as a clue, not as throwaway lore. Warhammer 40k Mechanicus 2 is that type of sequel that takes what worked in the first game and expands it in all the right directions. And for those who came out of Baldur's Gate 3, addicted to decisions that shape the story and deep character customization, this game delivers exactly that, but in a much more focused and brutal tactical turn-based combat system. The big catch here is that you can choose to play as both the Adeptus Mechanicus, that cult fanatic about machines, and the Necrons, basically robotic skeletons that woke up after millions of years and chose violence. And each faction has its own complete narrative campaign with gameplay and story differences, and the ending depends on your choices. What excites me a lot is the strategic layer they added. Besides the classic tactical combat, now you also manage resources and build outposts on the planet's surface map. Deciding where to position your leaders but using them to hold territory means they won't be available for combat. So you really need to think strategically about every decision, and that time pressure from the first game is back. The more you explore and prepare as the Mechanicus, the more time the Necrons have to activate their troops and gain power on the map. So every movement has a real cost. The combat system got a brutal upgrade with destructible cover. The Mechanicus will try to hide behind cover because they are more fragile, while the Necrons simply advance without fear, destroying everything in their path, which creates a very interesting asymmetric dynamic between the factions. And the leaders from the first game return, but now they are all playable with their own unique skill trees that you can customize to deal massive damage alone or focus on buffing the whole team, which gives that build freedom we love in tactical RPGs. Visually, the game is much more polished, with unit models and environments more vibrant and dynamic maps that change during the battle, and the cognition points system, or dominion points for the Necrons, became much more flexible. Now, each unit can collect points by completing minor objectives, which removes that rigidity and lets you experiment more with different tactics. For those who enjoy the depth of BG3 but want something more focused on tactical combat with real narrative consequences, Mechanicus 2 is building on top of an already excellent base in a very smart way. Star Wars Zero Company is a single-player focused, turn-based tactical game developed by BitReactor in collaboration with Respawn Entertainment and Lucasfilm Games. It takes place at the end of the Clone Wars and puts you in the role of Hawks, a former Republic officer with customizable characteristics who commands Zero Company, a very improbable elite squad. The narrative hook is very direct and just the way I like it. This group needs to swallow their differences and operate in the shadows to contain a threat that could consume the galaxy, with an original story and player decisions having real weight on the direction of events. And yes, the vibe they leave in the air is almost an XCOM in Star Wars, with positioning, use of unique abilities, and that combat that punishes silly mistakes. What excites me the most, especially for those coming from Baldur's Gate 3, is the promise of depth outside the fights. Besides missions, you will have a customizable base of operations and a network of informants, allies to collect intelligence and prepare better for the next objectives. There's also the idea of creating bonds between squad members that turn into synergies in combat. And for me, that is the sauce that transforms a good tactical game into a game you talk about with a friend as if they were characters in a tabletop campaign.
But that's the job, and they get it done.
Abyss Rebel is a tactical turn-based RPG with a very dangerous expedition feel. The pleasure of the game doesn't come from a gigantic cinematic campaign, but rather from assembling a squad, creating builds, and surviving difficult decisions in a dark and frozen world. It takes place in an icy archipelago at the edge of the universe, where you leave an isolated shelter and face mutant pirates, ancient machines, and sinister forces lurking beneath the surface. The loop seems very addictive and more roguelite than BG3. You lead a team of 4 characters on a small boat, choose routes with randomness, grab rewards, face bosses, and accept that failing is part of the process. The idea is that every trip is a risky run, and the game reinforces this with persistent progression in the shelter, permanent upgrades, training, unlocks, so you come back stronger in the next attempt. In combat, the promise is that square grid turn-based chess with positioning and sequence mattering a lot, only with a heavy layer of loot, items, and passive effects that change the behavior of your skills. And the touch I find most stylish: mechs. As a table turner, you can summon a mech in decisive moments. It drops dealing area damage and enters as a strong unit to turn a fight around when the game puts you at a numerical disadvantage. Never's End is a tactical, turn-based RPG where you are an immortal warrior spirit, Quicksilver, returning from death in the middle of a global cataclysm when humanity is already hanging by a thread and only a safe village remains surrounded by the darkness of the Never. What hooked me right away is the idea of systemic and very physical combat. The battlefield isn't just a board, it's a manipulatable ecosystem. The game talks about simulating temperature, weather, wind, water level, and even terrain density, and this becomes a real tactical tool, like draining a river, flooding an area, creating rain and fog, freezing enemies, setting fires, raising terrain to gain an advantage, or melting the ground into lava. This is exactly the type of creative freedom I associate with the pleasure of experimenting in BG3. You aren't just using a skill, you are inventing a solution. Now, the boldest catch, and one I already imagine dividing opinions, is how the group works. Instead of recruiting companions the traditional way, you possess people from the village and transform these residents into vessels with the explicit moral cost of erasing their soul and will. Every ally you gain is, in practice, another life condemned to fight until they win or die. And this gives a narrative weight very different from the usual in tactical games, because it's not just building a strong party, it's carrying the consequence. And outside of battles, it goes for an open world structure with very distinct biomes, exploration of ruins from a golden age, clearing corrupted settlements, dormant temples, and lost technology with that feeling of rebuilding civilization as you advance. If you love Baldur's Gate 3 for the RPG session that went right, atmosphere group, adventure, and that feeling of braving something dangerous, then Banquet for Fools is one of those names you should write down now, because it puts you on a very direct mission. The Pavura needs 4 volunteers to investigate the mystery of an abandoned village, and boom, you're already deep in a story that smells like good trouble. And the best part is that it sells itself exactly as a party-based brawler RPG. So the promise here is less tactical chess and more let's survive this chaos together. What gets me about this game is the travel structure. You explore the island of Invimona in an open world scheme with 4 generated companions. And this changes the roleplay vibe because the team isn't just classes, it's almost a cast that is born with you. The idea of crossing rivers and coastlines carrying a boat with a pack burro, yes, a beast of burden that literally helps transport the boat, gives a very grounded sensation, like a real expedition. And I love when a game transforms travel into part of the adventure, not just walking to the next marker. And when things turn into combat, the official text already makes it clear that the game wants you to throw down with a very hostile fauna and folklore. Beasts, ghosts, grave robbers, bandits, all this while you try to understand the secrets of this cursed frontier. For those coming from BG3, I see the must-know factor more in the spirit of party plus exploration plus narrative consequence along the way, only with a much more action focus than turn-based tactics, which can be a refreshing change when you want a CRPG with more immediate impact.